any brand starting out, is to focus on what your consumer needs and building that into the product, and everything else, like, strip it away. Try to strip it away, because otherwise your product gets too expensive or it gets too confusing.
Jeffrey, thank you so much. I'm glad we finally connected. Like try number two. Thanks for being here. Thanks so much for doing this.
Hey, Brian, thanks for having me.
So why don't we just talk about a little bit about background about yourself, maybe introduce yourself to the viewers.
I was in product innovation and R&D. My background, I'm a food scientist by training. I've been in the natural products industry for over 10 years now, mostly specializing in plant-based foods. Worked on a variety of products. Was really lucky to have a chance to work on, products from comfort foods to dairy-free cheeses to frozen meals, and of course to, at Vega, working on the portfolio of protein powders or nutrition powders, supplements, as well as nutrition bars and RTD drinks. Right now, back in plant-based, working on the next generation of plant-based cheeses.
Quite the resume you've got there, and a very diverse portfolio of products. So I'm sure the viewers are going to be really excited to hear what you have to say. R&D is a very broad topic. A lot of the viewers that watch this particular channel, they're startups, right? They're the entrepreneurs that are thinking about creating a brand new brand. They're either working with a contract manufacturer's R&D, or in some cases, they're actually thinking or heavily considering working with an R&D consultant to develop their product first and then bring that to a contract manufacturer. So, we want to look at everything from that lens, if at all possible. But if there's anything else you want to bring to the table here, I'm happy to do that. Why don't we start with maybe just like the common mistakes that people make, newbies would make?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for myself, from what I've seen in the entrepreneurial space, I worked with startups. I've led a startup myself. Is a lot of founders or a lot of product developers could lead into making a product and really focused on what they want personally. And I think that's super important, obviously, as a startup, because you have the idea. But as you're building the product, it's really important to be really clear with what your consumers at the end of the day want and what they prioritize. Otherwise, what it could turn into is you're creating a product for yourself, but is there a big enough market, out there for this product you're creating for yourself? So that's, I think, it's really important. And what it could lead to is something called feature creep. Feature creep is when you're building a product and you're really adding different types of features in there that creep in, per se. And at the end of the day, you have a product that's has a lot of features, really good, for on paper. But when you build the product, either there's too many features and it either tastes bad, or the texture is wrong, or the pricing's just way out of whack. So I think really focusing on who this consumer is, what they actually care about, is really important at the start and throughout, so that you can really make key decisions on what your formula actually needs, and what it actually solves for the consumer.
Any thoughts on how they can really figure out what their consumer really wants? Are there any best practices that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think talking to your consumer is definitely the number one. So, for example, when I was starting a startup or leading a startup, one of the big things is we were making, it wasn't supplements, it was more so like frozen plant-based meals. I reached out to 20 people, friends of friends or family, who were plant-based or trying to eat more plant-based, and just called them and say, how do you shop? How do you shop in the store? What do you look for when you pick up a product? What do you care about when you pick up a product that's plant-based, and why do you eat plant-based? Just to really understand the rationale of consumers make at the grocery store on the shelves when they're choosing products. Definitely very important, the supplement or the health space, because there's just so many products. There's so many products with unique ingredients, unique benefits. How do you stand out? What do people care about? What draws their attention, and what would they be willing to pay for? And really trying to dig into that from a consumer need perspective, understanding why they buy certain products, what compels them to buy it to solve a certain need, and then trying to fill that space. A great way is also to share your product idea and really get them to provide feedback or criticism. I think in the beginning it might be a bit hard for people generally are pretty polite and like, oh, that's a great idea, but trying to dig deep and ask questions to try to get to the bottom of it, and get them to almost critique it. And that's like super valuable for sure.
You remember Nat from Vega from marketing? We had her
Yeah.
on the channel, and she mentioned that she would actually go and talk to people shopping in the aisle in some cases to kind of
Yeah.
dig deep into like, well, why are you buying, or what do you like about this brand or not like, et cetera, et cetera. So that was
Yeah.
interesting. So the market research, I think, is a big component. You talked about feature creep. Where does cost fit into all this, if at all?
Obviously very important. I think especially in the climate right now, if you don't have a product that is profitable right from the gate almost, or even has a very clear path to profitability, it's very hard to be able to make it as a brand, as a company. And it's definitely very hard for like, anyone starting out, entrepreneurs that don't have a background in food science or any of those connections with suppliers to really build out and understand how much ingredients cost. Any entrepreneur, anyone starting to make a product is probably buying ingredients from Amazon or like, the local supplier, and trying to use those costs to build a what we call like a bill of materials, a costing list. But that's obviously very much out of whack, right? That's not the cost that suppliers give. So I think my recommendation there is, start reaching out to suppliers early. They might not want to talk to you, because obviously you don't really have a company or like you're very small, but, start reaching out early. There's definitely small ones locally in each area, and start trying to understand what is the cost, the actual cost of ingredients. And building that into the product.
When you say reach out to suppliers, are you talking about ingredient suppliers, or are you saying the contract manufacturers reach out to them first, or are you talking about go to the bulksupplements.com or an Amazon or the actual manufacturer of the raw materials or raw ingredients?
I am talking about the ingredient suppliers.
Okay.
As the first one, since the formula is quite important to build out, but also the packaging. I think the packaging would come next, and then the co-packers. I think that the challenge is co-packers will likely not want to talk to you or share any pricing without a formula, because they don't know what they're at the end of the day producing. So I mean, getting the formula piece is probably the easiest one to start pricing out. I think other than that, it's really understanding what price point you typically need to hit. So you can do that from looking at the product in the market. What are some of the closest competitors charging? Work that back down to, what are those, what's the COGS, the cost of goods that you need to hit from an ingredient perspective. So you're very clear as to, okay, if we're selling at this price, which you need to, which is already set by the market, you need to hit this in terms of ingredients. And there's no way around that. Yeah,
that's typically the approach that we encourage, is look at the MSRP of your competitors and kind of reverse engineer what your COGS should be. But I like this idea of, hey, another way to really get more transparency as to what the costs could be, at least for manufacturers, to reach out to the ingredient suppliers directly. I really like that idea. So
right.
Yes. That's some sleuthing for sure, and a little bit more work, but you definitely get that visibility. And I think that the idea of packaging, a lot of people forget about packaging. Could you kind of give some insight as to why you're bringing up packaging now, and what are some thoughts around packaging when you look at that in the context of your formula? What are some of the considerations you normally have?
Packaging is very important, as we know. I mean, branding perspective, I guess branding and packaging is very important, especially in an age where digital marketing is so big, online shopping is so big, that your packaging has to do a lot of work for you. Packaging has two things, to protect the product, number one, but also for a way to communicate to consumers. So keeping those two very top of mind. So protecting the product could be things like, if your product is, for example, very high fat, let's say it's keto, it has coconut oil, that's very subjective to rancidity. Ensuring that your packaging has like what we call a high moisture, high oxygen barrier. So that helps delay some of that rancidity over the shelf life, to ensure you have a long enough shelf life. And then, how does it show up for the consumers from a branding perspective? Obviously, there's a ton of options in terms of the touch and the feel and the thickness and the shape and size. And I think as entrepreneurs just starting up, or a brand just starting up, they have stock sizes and they have custom sizes. Custom sizes, any size is possible if you hit a certain MOQ, but they have most suppliers definitely have sizes that they make continuously for other brands. So those are great ways to kind of get in because, those are typically cheaper, because they make those sizes very often. They have really good margins on those sizes and economies of scale. So trying to ask them about, okay, what are some of these stock sizes that they have is a great way to start as well. And you could innovate, maybe not on shape and size, but you can more innovate with how you brand the product and the artwork and all that.
So how about building features into the product? Any thoughts around how to do that, or any good practices that you'd recommend?
When they're thinking about idea is obviously doing competitive analysis. You should know what's in the market, what type of products are there from, ranging from small, unique, startup brands to kind of the bigger, more developed brands. So you understand kind of what people are saying, what ingredients they're using, and also, what features they're really building into the products that are currently in the space. I think everyone thinks their idea is very unique, but at the same time, there's probably a product that exists out there that's very close to what you're thinking or, very much adjacent to it. And, my recommendation there is don't try to reinvent the wheel from the beginning. You don't have to start a formula from scratch. You can look at some of this inspiration and kind of reverse engineer, looking at the ingredients of a product that you think is close to yours. One thing is looking at some of the macros. So if you look at sugar, you look at our carbs, sugar, protein, fat, you can try to reverse engineer it back to understand, okay, if there's 4 grams of fat on the nutrition facts table, then there's probably 4 grams of, whatever it's coconut oil powder or whatnot in the ingredients in the formula. So you can reverse engineer to build a starting point for your product. And then obviously, going back to building the features, it's really understanding who that consumer is and what they want. And being really intentional for that as you build in those features for the product.
In this space, in particular the supplement space, in the food space, conventional foods, there's just so many, not necessarily copycats, but like you're saying, there's so many products that are adjacent to each other. Are there common themes that you've seen brands differentiate themselves with, or any practices that you might recommend, or avenues that one could try to start with as they're creating their concept?
Definitely a very common challenge in the space. The products themselves technically in many cases are quite easy to make. I guess they're not very challenging to develop because the ingredients are very common, or there's a lot of brands out there that's easy to enter the space. There's low barriers to entry. I think that's the term. So how do you stand out as a brand, or how do you make your product stand out? I think number one, obviously building a very strong brand and the brand positioning is very important to have your product stand out. But from how do you tie that back to product it goes back to, for me, is about features and being really clear as to what are the features that are most important for your consumer out there. And they're very much honing in on those features as part of your brand positioning or your marketing, so that you're not all over the place, that it's very easy for consumers to understand what you are and why they need you. So I think, for example, some brands that really stand out is, for example, Noon. Noon tablets. They have the hydration tablets. They have this. They're very much focused on hydration for the consumer, building into a consumer routine of any consumer drinks water. It's an easy something you can add to your water bottle. Very much focused the brand and the positioning around enhanced hydration, and they don't deviate from that. They don't go into protein powders, don't go into granola bars. They focus on hydration for the consumer. Sure, there's other products, other brands that are also trying to enter the space, but Noon has built such a strong brand and really owning that space, and being very top of mind for the natural consumer in terms of hydration. So I think that's number one, and really spending their money on their products that really focus around hydration, ingredients like electrolytes or or flavors to boost the experience, or branching into some of the immunity or probiotics, but always tying that back to hydration. I think that's really key for any brand starting out, is to focus on what your consumer needs and building that into the product, and everything else, like, strip it away. Try to strip it away, because otherwise your product gets too expensive or it gets too confusing for the consumer.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think a lot of startups, first they get tunnel vision on the formula or the concept, right? So they just think, if I get the formula out, I develop that well, it'll sell well. And then the other piece is they want to say everything that the ingredients can do. And I agree with you. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of confusion then as to what exactly your product is for, what the brand stands for as a result. So yeah, good point on that clarity, and just focus in on that one thing. And then from there you can branch out, but everyone knows you're the hydration brand.
Less is more sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Now here's a topic that I'm a little bit familiar with. Where does compliance come into the picture for you from an R&D perspective?
From an R&D perspective, especially in the natural health product space, compliance comes in from the beginning. From when we developed what we call the product brief. The product brief talks about anything from the features, from what type of certifications we want, from type of ingredients, what we want to target, what's the consumer insight we're trying to solve. Everything is really on this 1-pager or 2-pager product brief, and compliance is really very much part of that, because at the end of the day, this industry is regulated, getting more and more regulated, and really understanding if the idea that you have or in the company, if marketing has, is actually feasible from a legal perspective, so that we don't get to the very end or get to the middle and be like, oh no, we can't do that, we wasted all this time. So having the eyes on this product brief or this idea up front will be very valuable to kind of saving time going down the wrong path. Food and natural health supplements, obviously this is your expertise in terms of the knowledge, but food and natural health supplements, food is definitely less strictly regulated. Natural health products has much more strict regulations that could be clear or unclear out there. In terms of how they show up on packaging, how even the nutrition facts table shows up versus the supplement facts table shows up is very different. But also it's regulated in a sense that, food is regulated in a sense that certain ingredients that could go into natural health products actually cannot go into food. For example, something that's very top of mind right now for consumers or in the market is ashwagandha. For example, there's a lot of conversation about ashwagandha, obviously as an adaptogen, but can it actually go into food? I think the general consensus right now is no, but that's also still very much a gray area, especially with startups not being regulated, foods not really being regulated as closely, that you still see products or food products with ashwagandha in it, versus ashwagandha can go into NHP products. It just needs to go through a certain process of vetting. In a sense, some more leeway with NHPs, because it's very clear as to what can or cannot be in it, versus in food it's not as regulated there.
Yeah, it's not as clear. I think that's the problem, is in the food space, and we're talking in the context of Canada right now. Yeah. In the food space, there's no explicit list per se, for the most part, as to which ingredients are not allowed or are allowed. Whereas in the natural health products, there is more of that clarity. And when it's not clear, the typical entrepreneur might think, well, if it's not clear, then I can do it, right? Yeah. Whereas the guys watching you, the enforcers out there, the litigators, the agencies, like, well, if it's not clear, it means you can't do it, right? Like that's right. Kind of the conundrum that I think a lot of people are in. Very helpful. Sounds like you've got compliance under your belts, a little bit of experience there, which is always nice to see. Okay, so I want to close this out a little bit with the experience you talked about from an entrepreneurial standpoint. What are some of the common misses that an entrepreneur might have from an R&D lens, like wearing both hats from your standpoint? What do you think are the common things that the entrepreneur might miss that you would catch, knowing what you've seen so far and have done so far in your professional experience?
Had the opportunity to lead a plant-based food brand for a couple of years. Started my own kind of local little skincare brand in the natural space for a few years as well. Mostly when I work for other startups as well as small companies, work very closely with the entrepreneur, or at least an environment that's very much about entrepreneurial spirit and moving fast and failing fast and learning. I think in terms of balancing the entrepreneurial side and the product development side and building a strong business case, strong business that could add long-term value for consumers, be successful over time, I always lean into something called DVF. I'm not sure if you heard of it, but desirability, viability, and feasibility. So basically, it's a framework developed by this company called IDEO that breaks down how to build like an innovative product and ways of thinking around it. So desirability, asking the question, do consumers want it? Do people want it? And really understanding what is that pain point for the consumer and do people actually want it? So desirability. So V stands for viability. Can you make money? Building out that P&L, building out those margins, understanding at each part of the P&L where the money is going, down to the bottom, how much profit you can actually make. Can you make money? The last letter is F, feasibility. Can you make it? Can you make it from a product technology perspective? Can you make it from a resourcing perspective? Can you make it from a legal perspective? Is that allowed? And also, can you make it on time? Can you make it fast enough to launch the market, to capture a trend that's in the market? And if not, what resources do you need there? So trying to answer all three of those questions throughout from ideation to commercialization is really important. And it's just a framework to help you think about how to build a product.
And I do know that you are able to provide some consulting services from an R&D standpoint. Could you elaborate a little bit more as to what kind of services you do offer?
I work with brands to start anywhere from ideation to commercialization. So ideation piece is, the piece of scoping out the idea, getting any feedback on a new idea, building out some type of innovation strategy, our pipeline, our competitive analysis, pricing analysis, all the way to hands-on developing the product. I can work with product developers or brands to develop the product on bench or provide guidance there as how to start or solve a specific technical issue that the brand is having, and then all the way to commercialization, finding those co-packers, starting those conversations, or finding the suppliers and really scaling that product into commercialization. People can reach out to me on LinkedIn and find me there.
Are you handling all dosage forms, all formats, or are there ones that you specialize in or prefer to work in?
My experience has been mostly in powders, bars, RTDs, as well as plant-based foods. So generally around that area. I don't really work too much with capsules or tablets in that realm.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for doing this. It was a pleasure for me to learn so much from you today, and it was really good to see you again. It's been so long. Thank you so much for doing this.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Brian.